Cosby, who was released from a Pennsylvania prison yesterday, now a free man after the state Supreme Court there reversed Cosby's indecent assault conviction. The court threw out his conviction, saying prosecutors violated a deal meant to shield Cosby from criminal prosecution. NBC News correspondent Stephanie Gosk has details.
We love you, Mr. Cosby!
Bill Cosby is a free man. His conviction tossed out, his record wiped clean. He cannot be retried. He appeared briefly before reporters outside his home.
Today, innocence came to Mr. Cosby.
Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that the decision to charge Cosby with sexual assault in 2015 was an affront to fundamental fairness, and the prosecution violated Cosby's due process. Cosby calling into a radio show.
This is for all the people who have been imprisoned wrongfully, regardless of race, color, or creed. Because I met them in there.
The 83-year-old was serving a 3 to 10-year sentence in maximum security prison after a jury found him guilty in 2018 of sexually assaulting Andrea Constand. At the time, Cosby's other accusers celebrated the verdict outside the court.
I feel like I'm dreaming. Can you pinch me?
Constand, a former Temple University employee, said Cosby drugged and sexually assaulted her in his Pennsylvania home in 2004. Cosby said the interaction was consensual. In 2005, the district attorney at the time, Bruce Castor, who later would go on to be one of President Trump's impeachment attorneys, did not bring charges. Castor testified that there was not enough evidence, but instead he made a verbal agreement not to prosecute Cosby if he would give a deposition in Constand's civil case. That same deposition became the basis for a new DA to charge him 10 years later, days before the statute of limitations expired. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court says prosecutors broke the promise. A spokesman for Cosby said this is justice, and justice for Black America. One of the prosecutors from the trial, Kristen Gibbons-Fedden, firing back.
I'm disturbed, I'm distressed that they are again exploiting our thirst for justice in his name.
Stephanie Gosk reporting there. The district attorney who brought the case, Kevin Steele, says Cosby was found guilty by a jury and was released on a procedural issue. Joining us now, the attorney you saw in that piece, Kristen Gibbons-Fedden. She's an MSNBC legal analyst and was a prosecutor in the first case against Cosby and a special prosecutor in the second. MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savallo still with us as well. Kristen, let me begin with you. Take me back to 2005 and Bruce Castor striking this deal with Mr. Cosby, that a verbal agreement, we're told, that he would not prosecute him if he testified in the civil case. Is that out of the ordinary? Is that something you've seen before? And should it have been grounds for the Supreme Court to overturn Cosby's conviction?
I have to say that I do respect our Supreme Court, and I respect their findings. But not only is it unseen and unheard of, but I would assert and allege that it actually didn't happen. I think one of the things that is really important is when non-prosecutorial agreements are made, they are in writing, they are approved by the court, and Bruce Castor, who had been the DA for a number of years, knew that, had actually implemented that in prior cases. And so it's not like this was something that he did not know. And so a verbal agreement like that not only doesn't happen, but I think the other thing to emphasize is that if it were to have happened, it would have been in writing, it would have been approved by the court. And there were other indicia that I'm happy to go through that kind of firm up, for me at least, the fact that I don't believe that it happened.
Well, so you say you respect the Supreme Court, and I respect your stance on that, but how can we respect the Supreme Court if you're saying it acted on something that maybe didn't even happen, number one, and if it did happen, a verbal agreement, it certainly should not have been grounds to overturn this conviction?
Well, in my belief, they accepted the testimony of Bruce Castor. When I look at all the facts, and keep in mind, I was there during the day-and-a-half hearing where we had Bruce Castor on the stand, where he testified as to this alleged promise. The things that he stated were contrary to a lot of the other evidence that was made. For example, he testified that he had informed Cosby's attorney, as well as Ms. Constand's attorneys, that he was making this promise. Ms. Constand's attorneys took the stand and stated that this promise was never made to them. In fact, they had no knowledge of it until he went on TV saying that this had happened. Number two, he released a press release moments after declining charges, stating that he would revisit the decision to decline charges should the need arise. An individual who makes a promise that he is not going to prosecute someone surely doesn't make that type of press release. And I understand that the press release was seen by the court as meaning something different. But again, I think the plain language of what he stated is very clear. I think in addition to that, the fact that Bruce Castor was only the DA of Montgomery County speaks also volumes to whether or not he could really bind Cosby in perpetuity for other types of self-incriminating crimes. What I mean by that is that Bill Cosby didn't make any incriminating statements regarding any crime that he committed in Montgomery County, which was only the purview by which Bruce Castor could have immunized him. Yeah. His incriminating statements were for crimes that he committed against women in other jurisdictions, of which Bruce Castor would have had no authority to give him immunity. So with all of those things said, I don't believe that there was a promise, and I don't believe there was detrimental reliance.
Kristen, the Mr. Cosby and his supporters and the people around him are touting this as an exoneration, that justice has been finally carried out for him. But did the Supreme Court actually say anything about his guilt in the charges on which he was convicted? In other words, was there a statement about whether or not he did the things that he was convicted of doing, or was this just about this procedural motion, this one little blip that you were talking about, this oral agreement?
This was solely about the procedural, the technicality. And in fact, the jury of his peers stated that he was guilty. And while the guilty no longer stands, the factual finding behind what the jury said still does. They found, after all of the testimony, after Andrea Constand testified, they found that he gave her a drug, rendered her incapable of consent, and then sexually assaulted her.
Danny, what's your read about what we saw yesterday?
A lot of things Kristen said are spot on, but we've been calling this an agreement, and I would say that it doesn't even rise to the level of an agreement, and that's what the court concluded, because it used a principle from contract law called promissory estoppel, and that happens when you have parties that think there is a contract, but the contract fails. In this case, Bruce Castor didn't follow the explicit rules for offering immunity. So if there was no underlying contract, sometimes courts will say, hey, when one party makes a promise to another party and that second party relies to his detriment, to Cosby's detriment on that promise, and in this case, Cosby relied on a promise of non-prosecution and then gave up his Fifth Amendment right to against self-incrimination, sat down for a deposition, and that led to his prosecution. Now, the court struggled with the remedy. The court considered the possibility that they could just vacate the conviction and allow another prosecution, but instead they did something that's very rare. I want everyone to understand that winning on appeal is exceedingly rare. Winning on appeal and then a bar to re-prosecution is rarer still. So this is not something we're likely to see in a high-profile case, again, maybe even in our lifetime. But the court concluded that where there is no other remedy, or at least in their opinion, there was no other remedy for this promise, but to enforce it. And enforcing it means barring future prosecution. I understand Kristen's frustration. These were decisions that were made long before she ever thought about or heard about the Cosby criminal prosecution, before it was even a glimmer in Kevin Steele's eye, the subsequent DA or the later DA. So this was a decision that was made to not prosecute long ago, and it bound the prosecution years later. By the way, not surprised that the trial court refused to dismiss on this grounds. Trial courts don't like to take cases away from prosecutors. They'd rather the appeals court deal with it. And this was always an issue on appeal. It was an issue at the trial court. It was preserved, and it made its way up to appeal, where you see this stunningly rare occurrence here.
Bill Cosby convicted of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault against Andrea Constand this morning as a free man based on that oral agreement. Kristen Gibbons-Fedd and Danny Cevallos, thank you both so much. We appreciate your insights this morning. Mika?